My name is Charlie,
And I'm Neil.
and today we're going to be bringing to you a public live on the topic of the fear of getting well. Sometimes, in our experience, we know that people can start to have a really good idea of where it is that they're at in their own recoveries, their own mental health. But in my experience as well, a lot of the time we don't give enough time or attention the obstacles that we're going to face on our journey, attention to that, because sometimes you might know the end goal, you might know all of the steps that you're going to take to get there, but unless we can start to actually look to understand some of the fears that potentially might hold us back, it's going to make it harder for us to start to take some of those steps. So what that means for us today is that over the course of the next hour or so, we are going to be here to answer any and all of your questions relating to perhaps anxiety or fears that you might have around some of the directions that inherently you might know that you need to take. So to that extent, if you have any questions, any comments or anything like that at all, please do throw them at us today, and we're going to do our very best to help to guide you through that. Who are we? We are not academics. No, we are not medically trained.
No.
But what we are individuals with lived experience. Thank you. What we are individuals with lived experience. And to that extent today, what we have is the ability to offer perhaps a different, unique insight into some of the bigger topics in mental health. So that is kind of the premise of it. And with regards to my job role here, I'm a wellbeing coach, which means that I spend a lot of time helping members day in, day out. What about yourself, Neil?
Very much the same. I'm a wellbeing coach here, and we spend most of our days helping people like yourselves by kind of education, nurture, and obviously we're kind of aware that everybody's struggles are completely different. So that's our job role.
That is our job role. So like we say today, anything that's on your mind, anything that you want to bring to the table, please do, because we've committed ourselves to the next hour just to be able to bounce around some of these ideas. And with that in mind, if we move on to the first question that we've received today, our first question is, how has fear affected your life to date? It's quite a big question, Neil, isn't it?
It is. And again, I really need to go back to quite important what you said in terms of I kind of found out relatively where I wanted to go. And when I was heading in the right direction, that fear kind of just hit me again. It was almost like my anxiety had just come back all of a sudden because I hadn't planned for anything. So it affected me massively because I thought that I wasn't going to be able to get, and the kind of stopped me in my tracks. Many people find a struggle, don't they, Charlie?
It's absolutely true. I quite like that you brought what you brought in there, that for many of us, especially if we're struggling with our mental well-being, kind of become really familiar in anxiety. It's a thing that we're going to face, on a daily basis in our daily struggles, whether that's going out to meet people, whether it's going down to the shops, whether it's starting a new routine or a new hobby. But actually, like you say, when it comes to us making that inherent decision that we want to start to make changes with something based with a whole different set of fears, and it's like a reset almost.
It certainly feels like that, because on my journey, I kind of established my identity again, effectively. I became me again. And then when I got to the point, it was almost like feeling that I'd lost my identity again, because I didn't know how people would react to kind of a different person, if that makes sense. I was a much better, well-up person. And then I had some real fear I could connect again, or whether I might be slipping backwards. I had fears around how you speak to people, how they perceive you to be, because I was a different.
Yeah, it's true. And I think that's a really huge point that you brought in there. People sometimes can have this really fixed idea that in life you're one person, and people often say that people don't change. This is a thing that I entirely disagree with. In my experience, that we're going to go through phases where we have different identities, we belong to different groups, we view ourselves differently. And actually, in becoming well, we have to abandon the
Absolutely,
old.
yes.
We do. We have to abandon the old way that we've been and start to work towards forging a new higher self,
yes,
if you will. That's it. So plenty of fears that we're probably going to start to acknowledge today with regards to what we're going to see as we go through that process of transformation. With regards to fear, though, coming back, how has fear affected your life today? And this really succinctly, I know that when I first started to fall into the traps of mental health, fear was the overriding thing that started to destroy my life. It meant that progressively over the course of a few years, my comfort might have been like that. I used to do quite a few things. I was into my swimming. I went to quite a few parties. I saw my friends. It really started to shrunk. Yeah, it really started to shrink. It really started to shrink. It shrunk. Absolutely. I think that fear, as far as I'm concerned, is the ultimate obstacle that we're going to have to overcome in our journeys to wellness, because it will ultimately stop us from getting A to B. Depression, shame, guilt, so many other things we might have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. We know what the changes are that we need to make, but fear, again, will just create that barrier, and it can feel immovable.
Yeah, it sometimes feels, doesn't it, that you're just locked, that, you know, the fear stops you achieving the goals that you really want to achieve. And with the work that I did, you know, I felt that I overcame that. And then all of a sudden, when something else was facing me with an unknown outcome, that anxiety started to kick in again for me, if that makes sense.
Certainly does. It certainly does. I can see that we've had a comment. I'm just going to read it. It says, I have severe anxiety, as in my work, there are lots of people leaving and it's like I'm feeling lost. So for you, for the person who's made this comment, feeling anxiety at work because people, like you say, you've got used to leaving, that might mean there's a change in either the atmosphere at the office or the responsibilities that might be coming your way as well. I think that absolutely is a fear that is very normal and very rational that a lot of us are going to start to face potentially as we go through life as well. What I really want to focus on here is that when it comes to getting well, there are so many different things we might want to incorporate. And I think something that's important for a lot of people is having a good work environment and a good work-life balance. And to that extent today, if we're going to recognize there are any fears that are stopping you from getting to where you want to around that work, then these kind of things that we need to acknowledge.
Yes, absolutely. If there is any kind of fears that you might have that are, you know, important around your work environment, around your relationships, now's the time really to kind of ask us some questions, and we'll do our best to kind of guide you and let you know some of the things that might for us. So, you know, it's an ideal opportunity.
Those fears and feeling comfortable in sharing them. I can see another comment. Hey, question being, what is your definition of recovery or wellness? Your definition of recovery or wellness? So, regarding this, I think that there are so many different answers that, but I've, over my time, I think that I used to have a definition of wellness that was completely unrealistic. I don't know if you used to think the same thing.
Absolutely.
For me,
quite an interesting question.
It is. And I think this is one that we address because we actually need to really start to set rules.
Yeah.
When I was unwell, for me to be well or to consider myself well, what I knew was to ultimately, I felt like I needed to have a really, really high job. I felt like I really needed to find my bank account. I've just had a message. The internet is struggling here. So what we're going to do, and apologies if you're still managing to follow this live, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look to change the connection up. It might be that we drop out for a couple of seconds, but I'm hopeful that in a minute we'll have something that's a little bit more stable. So bear with me, and hopefully we'll be back in just a moment. Let's see.
Ah,
I think we're back. I don't want to jump ahead too far, but I suspect that we have managed to
I
return.
think we may have done.
I think we've achieved it. Guys, if you're still with us, could you send us a little comment to know that you've got our video and audio feedback? We have managed to return indeed.
Ah, fantastic.
Celebration. Perfect. Thank you very much. All right, we are back in the swing. Thank you guys for your patience. We had an issue with the internet our end. We have managed to switch the source of the internet now, so hopefully we're not going to be having any issues going forward. But again, thank you eternally for the patience that you've had in us coming back here today. What is quite nice is that I can see that we've actually had some answers come through
yes.
with regards to the question that we asked. The comments say, my wellness is stability between home life and work. Home life isn't where it was a year ago. Work life is changing so much. So now my stability is quite unstable. Really, really, really good comment that.
Yeah.
I think that wellness is going to be different for everybody, but I think balance is a key word that we need to be addressing.
I was just about to say exactly the same in terms of that. Balance is so important, because, you know, in terms of my experiences, the thing that kept me well at the point in time where I was trying to work through it was my work. And then I found myself totally kind of oblivious of the other things that were going on around me. So I kind of worked through that kind of stuff and realized that balance is really important, because you don't want to work all of the time, and you certainly don't want time on your own all of the time. You have to find a medium that actually works for you, and that does keep you well, because you were talking about social connection. I think social connection from a work perspective is really important, because that's where you start the process of actually engaging with people, feeling comfortable with people, especially if you suffered with those kind of things previous. But then if you kind of just focus on one area and the other things go off kilter, that creates effectively unwellness, in terms of you're managing one thing exceptionally well and the other one is causing you fear and concern, and especially around kind of children and relationships. I don't know if you felt that.
Well, for myself, not children, I'm afraid to say, not at this point, but certainly no relationships, having imbalance in some of the intimate relationships I've had in the past, spending all my time with a specific individual rather than actually dividing my time equally where I wanted and needed to put my energies as well. But also talking about unbalance, I think this can apply to almost everybody, regardless of your scenario. We can become really unbalanced in our unwellness. For me, the unbalance looked like me spending all of my time on my own, seeing friends very, very, very rarely, not really talking about my feelings, and certainly not having anything outside of my small routine that gave me any kind of connection with meaning and purpose, the social side, or anything like that. And I just love that word balance has been brought in there in particular, because what we're all actually trying to strive to do in our journeys to becoming well is to find that balance that works for us between spending time at work, at home, with friends, family, doing our interests, giving to other people is hugely important as well. I think all of life is just us striving to try and get that balance there, to an essence. The reason I think it's important that we address this question, I've seen there's another comment and we'll come to that in a second, but because when I was really unwell, I used to have a completely wacky, unrealistic idea of what it meant to be unwell, for what it meant to be well. For me to be well, I had to be happy all of the time. I had to have a ridiculous amount of money in my bank account. I was going to be defined by my status in life, effectively. But actually, having now done the work that I needed to do, my definition of wellness is something that's completely changed, and it's much more realistic and easy to reach as well.
I couldn't really agree more, because it's quite an interesting question, because I often get asked whether I'm well again. And wellness for me it's something that I possibly strived for. In terms of your story, you know, you felt you had to do this, that, and the other to be well and be, you know, reaching the point where you were able to function properly. So you kind of in your mind had what wellness looked like. But now I often get asked the question, it really doesn't bother me now what wellness is, because wellness is very much an individual thing, isn't it?
It is individual.
So I feel that I'm well because I'm well in myself, and I'm able to manage, and I'm able to cope, and I manage to have that balance now, which is what Charlie's been talking about. So I don't feel that I need to strive any further. I'm kind of in maintenance. We often talk about that, don't we? We kind of reach an area, and as long as we can maintain our wellness in ourselves and within all the other aspects, then that's good enough for me.
That's it. I think the way that we can almost define it is that what you're doing right now is you are leading a life which has that subjective balance, the balance that matters to you. That means you are managing your mental wellness rather than your mental illness.
Yes, absolutely.
That's a real, I think that's quite a nice way of looking at it. And absolutely, that is going to be different from everybody, but we just need to get this idea that for us to be well, we have to achieve 1,001 things. Unrealistic. It's actually just about making small tweaks, is what it is, and recognizing some of the areas we might need to make some small changes in, changing our routine, changing the way that we manage our feelings in the moment, that kind of thing. And actually, it isn't climbing a mountain. No. It really can start to happen quite quickly when you start to grasp the concepts that we're talking about. Should we have a look at, I know there was another definition that came up, and it reads, my definition of wellness is willing to change certain habits of my lifestyle and beliefs, and only then was I able to begin to move forward in my recovery.
What a great comment in there in terms of our beliefs, because that is very, very challenging. It was for me when I was kind of going through my journey, because I had specific beliefs about what I was should be achieving in life and all those kinds of things. And after a period of time of working through things, I did have to actually change some of my belief systems without a shadow of a doubt, because my beliefs were kind of off kilter. So that's a really interesting, just that word, you know, your belief systems, and just kind of looking at things like that and saying, is this belief, is it something that I live and breathe and I do every single time? And is that really fitting in with my wellness or my unwellness effectively?
That's exactly it. Love it. And the thing to take from this is it's about small changes, but my definition of wellness is willing to change. Willingness. That absolutely has to be a key component there. The second that we get bored, tired, frustrated where things have been, we actually start to develop this motivation, almost this desire for things to be different. And when we can harness that and make the small tweaks, then we're there.
Yes,
that's the key. So shall we move on to the next question? And I think we can have a little think on this one for a while, because what kinds of fears can hold you back? And I think the way that I've always examined this, if we're talking about anxiety in general, is that broadly speaking, there are two types of fear that can affect us. We can have fear of the unknown, which I think is actually quite normal. It's almost programmed into us to an extent. If we are in a situation that we understand everything about, we've done it 1,000 times before, we're going to feel comfortable. If we go into a new environment, we don't understand all the variables. Who knows what's going to be coming around that corner? So it's perfectly natural for us to have that one as well. But also, the way that I would call it, the second fear, is a fear of repeated mistakes.
Yes.
A fear of the past coming back and repeating itself in our future. If we have had 10 bad relationships in a row, let's say, it would be perfectly natural for us to start to build up this idea, this belief again, that every relationship from that point is just going to ultimately give us hurt, vulnerability, pain. And then we can start to develop these ideas that actually, if I go into that situation again, it's going to hurt me again. And then we can start to develop fears about doing that. So I could answer that broadly in two ways: fear of the unknown, fear of repeated mistakes. I'm just curious for yourself, Neil, was it one or the other that really held you back in your, or created the biggest obstacle for you?
Well, that's a really interesting question. You know, looking back on it, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I really think that it was fear of making repeated mistakes in my life. And like we were talking about a second ago, that was my belief. That was my absolute belief that whatever I tried, whether it be something new, whether it be something that I've even tried before, I would always have a fear of around making mistakes. And reality soon taught me that you do have a snapshot of things that might have gone on in one point in time, but that doesn't define that the rest of your life is going to be in that position. And that was hard for me to get my head around initially. So for me, it was really fear of repeated mistakes.
Absolutely. And just to validate that as well, if you've only had the same experience time and time again, it would be almost crazy if you think that the outcome would be different, right? Yeah. It's very logical for us to start to develop these fears, and it makes total sense. Yeah, we do have to start to face them as we go through. So I just in the comment that comes up, one of my beliefs is treat people the way you would like to be treated. That's good. When we understand the things that make us unique, we need to strive to live a life which matches those. But the next comment, fear of socializing, even when I know the people. So this is going to sound perhaps a little bit out there, but what I'm actually wanting to talk about today isn't necessarily the fears that we face on a day-to-day basis. I would like to know the fears that you're going to face if you put yourself into that socializing situation. If you recognize that socializing is something that you're going to want to do to get well, what are the fears that you're going to have to face on that journey as you get towards socializing? Did that make sense?
It does.
I'm looking for the fears behind the fears.
Yes.
Yeah.
I completely understand.
Good. I'm glad that you understand it. It made sense in my head. Yes. It's just hard to communicate that sometimes. We are looking for the fears that we're going to face as we take those steps already against our existing fears. So I want to move on to the next question, because I know that we've got half an hour left, and I really think it's important that we actually start to have a look at the different fears that we might be able to face as we go through our journeys to wellness. And we've spent a good long time thinking about this, haven't we? And we've drawn on our own experiences, the experiences that we've had with our members as well, and started to collate it effectively into a bit of a list for the fears that I think we're majoritively going to face as we move forward. We're going to address in order, and please comment away because I need to know your guys' thoughts on this. We're talking about the fear of leaving our old identities and letting go of the past. That's going to be one. Fear of the unknown. Who am I? What am I going to be? Fear of taking responsibility, because we can have some fears about actually transforming and growing into a new individual. Yeah. And what does that entail? Fear of relationships, I think we need to have a look at as well. The fear of having to face our emotions or stopping old unhealthy coping strategies. If we've been managing ourselves in a specific way for a long time, naturally that's going to give us some big fears as we transition. The fear of losing support as well, because sometimes if we've stayed in illness for a particularly long time, it can be a scary concept to have to lose the support of either friends, services, professionals, whatever it may be, because the recognition that in order for us to become well, we might need to do some things independently. Yeah, that's a fear that we're going to be looking at as well. The fear of being rejected. That's a brilliant one to mention. I think that's going to tie in nicely with the fear of relationships that we're going to start to look at as well. So to that end, I would like us to have a little look at the first header that we've got here today, the fear of leaving our identity and letting go of the past. I don't know about yourself, Neil. I think you kind of already started to allude it in the first part of the of this live here today. But for me, this is probably one of the biggest challenges and the biggest fears that people can face. If we have spent weeks, months, years, decades identifying with our illnesses, identifying wholly with the past and the things that have got us to this point where we are today, it can be a really scary idea that in order for us to get better, to transform, we're going to have to acknowledge that this old identity hasn't served us, and we're going to have to start to leave that behind in search of a new identity.
That is in itself scary, is it not? But you're absolutely correct, because that's a real big fear. But until you overcome that, and I like the point that you made, it's kind of just allowing yourself to let go of what's happened previous. You're creating a new you. It's almost, the way I put it across to a lot of people is, if you think about a snake, quite often it sheds its skin because it reaches a point where that skin is not serving its proper purpose. So it sheds and it builds a new skin, or a new skin grows. And that is very much using that scenario, Charlie. That's all about protecting that snake. If they didn't shed that skin, then that skin would kind of just cause them damage and harm. So they need that protection. And that's almost like the same kind of feeling that you get when you just need to kind of create a new person, because what you've got at the moment is not serving you very well, especially when we're unwell. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. That's my favorite analogy that I've heard from you in a while. That's brilliant. It's like we're snakes that need to shed our skins, and although it's comfortable, although we've lived in it for a long time, we have to recognize that sometimes the identities that we've formed around ourselves to protect ourselves are not self-serving. They are damaging.
Yes.
Is what they are in the long run. And when we start to have that recognition that we need to leave that behind in order to start to access a new way of being, it is terrifying. And a big part of that means that we stop being able to access the same reasons and excuses that we were giving ourselves in the past for not taking action towards becoming well. I want to address one thing in particular as we kind of touched on this subject here. And this is particularly around diagnosis. So often we allow our diagnoses to become a part of our identity. It can start to define who it is that we are, how it is that we live, what it is that we say, and how it is that we present to people in the world around us. A diagnosis can be a good thing. Initially, it's going to bring us a little bit of relief. It starts to contextualize what it is that's going on for us, but it also can be reassuring to know that we're not always entirely at fault for the way that we feel or the way that we behave, and potentially it can start to feel like perhaps it's our biology or it's something else that's contributing towards us feeling unwell. However, after a diagnosis has set in, we can start to identify wholly with the diagnosis and start to use I am statements, is how I'd call them. We might start to find ourselves saying things like, I am depressed, I am anxious, I am schizophrenic, I am bipolar. Whilst all those things could quite well possibly be true, what we're going to start to find is that the more that we use these identification statements, the more they are harming our potential for successful change and recovery. Rather than saying things like, I am depressed, you could say things like, I'm having a depressive spell.
Yes. Or I feel something.
I feel
sadness. I feel something, rather than I am. It's that's really interesting, because when you're talking about diagnosis, you can find some people that they get so fixated on that diagnosis sometimes, this is not everybody, that they kind of use, this sounds harsh, but they kind of use it as an excuse. That's the reason why I'm depressed, because I have a diagnosis.
That's it. And I just want to kind of build on that point there, using it as an excuse. You might find yourself potentially saying things like, I'm allowed to drink more often than others. I'm depressed.
Yes.
Diagnosis, justification. I don't need to go out. I'm anxious.
Yes.
I don't need to look after myself. I am mentally unwell. And that is a very damaging state of being, when you identify so wholly with your diagnosis that it excludes the possibility of change. I don't bring this in lightly. This is a thing that I think a lot of us all recognize, but certainly we also have had experience of this as well, no doubt. For me, when I was using drugs, I don't need to stop my drugs. I'm managing my anxiety. That was a lie that I told myself quite regularly, is what it was, and ultimately kept me trapped in a hole. The issue is that when we start to identify with our diagnosis, we are claiming it as a part of our totality, akin to a piece of ourselves or a piece of the puzzle that makes us us. But when we are going to start this recovery process, start to take the steps that we need to take, what we are essentially asking ourselves to do is to give up that part of ourselves, to give up that part of identity. And that is terrifying.
Yes.
The old justifications that we've been using for weeks, months, years, whatever it may be, suddenly we have to acknowledge for ourselves that they might no longer stick or be true.
Yes.
It's a huge one. It's a huge one. But there's also some other kind of things that come around our identity as well. I think probably a lot of us are going to recognize that a part of the reason that we're struggling with our mental health, it isn't always just because of a biological thing or whatever it might be. A lot of the time, the past has shaped us in some way, shape, or form. And in us being able to access the future, what we need to start to do is to come to terms with the past. Something that I think everybody has the potential to do is a little thing called romanticizing the past.
Yes.
It's not what it sounds like. It's not looking at the past with rose-tinted spectacles. Romanticizing the past defines when we start to build our whole identities around a series or single unfortunate event. It is a little bit like having had something terrible happen to you, being frozen in that moment of time, spending all of your time ruminating on that single moment and using that thing that happened, whether it's last week or 10 years ago, as a justification for why you're still struggling now. In becoming well, we're going to have to let go of the past, let go of the reasons for why it is we might find ourselves struggling in the first place. And it's that loss of justification suddenly. I'm going to keep going back to that loss of justification.
Yes. I think there's a whole element of things that you have to kind of do to progress and move forward. You know, self-acceptance is a real big one for me, you know, in terms of it kind of links quite closely to what you're talking about. It's just accepting things that have happened to me as an individual that has shaped my life, because that actually imprisons me effectively. I can't move on because I will always be fixated in that kind of area, you know. And I often was worried about the new person, me being this new person. And a couple of the comments have said, you know, fear of rejection, fear of breakdown relationships and stuff like that. But I think self-acceptance and feeling that what's going to happen is you're going to have those fears, you're going to have those things that are going to happen, but you have to face that kind of fear, and you have to accept the fact that we're human beings. We are going to have those thoughts and those feelings. So that's what I'm trying to get across is self-acceptance for me was one of the most important things.
And that's it. And it takes a large amount of willingness to be able to get there at all. So you're looking at a comment. We're going for the top one here?
Yes, I was just reading that. Go for it.
So, my past I wish I could erase. Every so often a vision or proof of it comes back and haunts me and can cause me instability. So we do need to spend some time acknowledging that actually the past might have had a great influence on how it is that we've become or come to join in with a session like this, or come to feel unstable in the first place. I think that this is a very hard thing that we need to recognize as well, that in order for us to get to a place where we're managing well, we're going to have to stop looking at the past, stop using it to justify why it is that we're unwell as well. I'm not saying that we don't acknowledge the past. We absolutely have to acknowledge the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's about reducing and getting rid of that emotional connection and attachment that we feel to the past. The way that I like to think about hanging on to the past is it's a little bit like a prison for your mind. You might be holding on to anger, holding on to frustration, really vilifying and directing a lot of resentment towards either yourself or other people or things that have happened in your life. And in your mind, it's almost like you've got this jail, and in that jail, you're keeping that person locked up. The only issue with doing that is the irony. You're only keeping yourself locked up. Yeah. You're not affecting the other person. You're not affecting the past. We can't have control over that. The only person it's affecting is you. And in moving through that, we have to acknowledge that the past needs to stay where it is, and we need to move through those feelings. Should we read another couple of comments?
Go for it.
I had fear of trusting in myself and other fears of believing I could recover, and fear of not living by my disorder. Those are some very poignant fears.
Absolutely.
Very poignant. Trust has been mentioned, I think, already, if I remember rightly. Trusting in yourself to be capable.
Yes.
Maybe.
I mean, that's definitely an element, isn't it? Is you know, when I'm talking about self-acceptance, we need to have trust in ourselves as well, because there will be fears, there will be concerns that we have, but we must kind of trust ourselves that we can get through these things. Like you're able to do it. Now, when you're going through this process, you will naturally, and it's a normal thing, have emotions that may stop you from doing those. But if you have the ability to say, trust in myself, I need to do this. It might not go 100% first time, but trust in the fact that you will actually eventually, if you take it bit by bit, step by step, and trust yourself, enabling you to move forward. And it does work. It does work.
Absolutely, it does. Okay, so if we move on to the next header, because I'm aware there are a few things I think we should probably be looking at. And as the next header comes up, we've just had a comment that's come in. Forgiving myself was the start of my acceptance. Forgiveness, I think that a lot of people will know this, but I'm a big pusher for the concept of forgiveness. I think that forgiveness is a wonderful thing, and ideally a lot of us need to work towards that for ourselves and others. A lot of people can get hooked up on that word. I know that for a fact. Some people can build up this concept that forgiveness is not a thing that's going to be accessible for everybody. But certainly detachment of feeling from the past, learning to put the past through this, showing compassion for yourself and the other things that have happened in your life is hugely important. And that is the start of acceptance of the reality. We've got fear of the unknown now. Fear of the unknown. And I kind of mentioned this really briefly at the start, but it's one of the biggest fears that we can have. If we find ourselves currently locked into the present, what is it that's going to be around the corner? What are some of the things that we might need to face on our journeys going forward? And if we don't know what they are, that in itself could be terrifying. I'm going to say this, that for myself, when I was talking about fear of the unknown, for me, it was fear around who was it that I was going to become. If I'd spent 6 years feeling and being a certain way, what was I going to look like when I got to wellness? And I was facing some pretty big existential questions. Who am I? If I'm not this person, who am I? I think a lot of people can struggle with their identities as well.
Yes, without doubt. I can't really comment much more on that in terms of it was kind of connected with me because I'm thinking back on myself, and that was probably one of my biggest fears. Because I was locked in where I was at that point in time for a long period of time, that was probably a big fear for me, is who am I? Who am I going to be? Am I going to be rejected? Am I going to be accepted? But one key thing for me was I missed certain elements of that, where when I was doing the work that I did, I started to kind of reframe things a little bit. So when I asked the questions like that, who am I going to be? I kind of started to say, I'm going to be excited about life. I'm going to be this different person, and it's going to bring me all the things that I really want to have in my life: happiness, connection, relationships, all those kinds of areas. And I think that's really part of transitioning from one place to another. And we tend to lose focus, do we not, sometimes, on what it will actually bring us if we face some of those fears. And I know they're unknown, and we all know that they're going to be scary. But what actually happens if you do that? And it's almost like somebody just took, just let me have my wings, and I was able to create myself. And also from that point of view is I kind of started to build the connections that were important to me. Those people that I used to trust as friends, soon kind of, once you work through it, some of those people weren't actually friends. They were damaging to me. They were keeping me locked up. So now, because I was excited about moving forward and moving on and creating this new persona, I look for the excitement now.
I think it can be quite liberating, isn't it? When you get through that fear to realize that there's kind of potential, something to be excited about. There's change, but it's going to be positive change. It brings about a whole different kind of attitude towards it. Fear of the unknown. Who am I? What can I achieve? Who am I once I get well? What does wellness look like? Not knowing what the future is going to hold. If we start to take these steps, can be a scary thing as well. But again, it's worth acknowledging at this point that wellness doesn't look like anything. No. Wellness is entirely subjective. There's no single definition, and only you will know once you've reached it. You are the ultimate verdict on that there. Having a look at the next header, we have the fear of taking responsibility. What kind of responsibilities might we be alluding to here, Neil? I don't know. Our actions off the back of our emotions?
Yes, most definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Contributing towards our community.
Yeah,
Self-care.
definitely. Yes, definitely self-care.
Debt. Finances.
Yes. New jobs,
New jobs. New jobs.
new
Absolutely.
opportunities.
New opportunities. General maintenance.
Yes.
My God, there's a whole lot that's going to
There's a
come with
whole
this.
host, isn't there?
There's a lot of things that are going to come along with us starting to take those
Yeah.
steps towards wellness. And sometimes the idea that, we're going to be the ones who are taking primary charge of having to enact some of these things in our lives can throw up a lot of barriers for ourselves as well. I know that when I was really unwell, was very dependent on a lot of people around me. My friends, or a couple of my friends, were very important to me because they lent me some money when I needed it.
Yeah.
I also liked them as friends, but they were in fact responsible for my finances in a strange way.
Yes.
My parents, they eventually provided a roof over my head. And again,
Yeah.
that was not my responsibility. That is something that I was helped with. I didn't work as much as I would like, and I just received a lot of support from people around me, and I wasn't taking responsibility very much in my life at all. And I recognized that, unfortunately, part of me coming well, I was going to have to start to retake that control back into my life, manage these things myself.
That's quite interesting in terms of taking responsibility. I ended up kind of living alone, and I wasn't aware really of what responsibilities are involved when you're trying to become the person you want to become. And I know it sounds silly, but it was things like being responsible to make sure that I have a correct diet because I don't really cook. Somebody else was cooking on my behalf. Having self-care and clean clothes. I didn't really get involved because somebody else was like, and I kind of felt that once I got a realization about you need to take responsibility, I felt at that point in time that people were enabling me to stay where I was in lots of different strange ways.
It's not their fault because they are ultimately
they're the care, they're the people that you have relationships. But what I was trying to allude there is once you start to take responsibility, I think you used the word, it kind of just makes you feel good because now, I don't feel that I have to kind of go back. So I'm taking responsibility and I'm perfectly capable of those responsibilities, if that makes sense.
So we just need to prove it to ourselves sometimes.
Yes.
But in the long run, it takes away shame.
Yep.
Takes away guilt. So yeah, and it gives you that power back, which actually, although some of it is arduous, you do actually come to appreciate it. Talking about lacking responsibilities, I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but there was only one thing I took responsibility for a while while I was at university. I loved showering, so I would keep clean. That was the only thing that I took care of, and even that was a selfish reason. I love showers, so that was the only thing that I would take responsibility for. Food, money, everything else that came into my life, somebody else provided that for me.
Yeah.
Actually, even the water I used in the shower, but that's a different story. But recognizing that ultimately, in order for us to become well, we're going to have to move from this victim mentality where we're defined by our old identities, our diagnoses, moving from victim mentality to creator, to taking charge. The ball is back in my court.
Yeah.
I am going to take this on. Scary.
It is totally scary,
It
but
is.
you become the master of your own ship, if that makes sense.
It does make sense.
You can achieve what you want to achieve. You're not having to rely on lots of other people. A lot of people that I speak to have a fear of, loss of the support mechanism that they might have actually had for quite a period of time. And that in itself is really daunting, isn't it? Thinking that you've been, unwell for a period of time, you've had some support, which is vital, which is why Seropia is here. We, support you, but there reaches a point where we have to become almost self-sufficient, if that makes sense. And that's fearful, but it's a step we need to take to achieve what we set out to achieve initially.
Exactly that, taking back a power and ball into our own court. It doesn't just stop with fear of losing support as well, because I think a lot of us can have that fear inherently, but it kind of goes beyond just kind of mental health services, professionals, etc. A lot of us can have real practical blocks as well. And so a fear that I've come across quite regularly working here as well is that some people can have a fear about taking on work, taking on volunteer opportunities because they feel they might affect their benefits. There's a financial implication there potentially as well. People can have other fears. If they've been supported in housing, for instance, and becoming well, they might need to acknowledge they no longer need that support. More responsibility comes their way, more things they need to work towards. And there are some real practical blocks as well that can actually, unfortunately, encourage, I'm not going to say enable, but encourage people to stay in their illnesses. And in my experience, and this is just something that I've observed, is that I have come across a few people in my time here where they've been more concerned about trying to get their next sick note rather than focusing on not needing that sick note. Which I understand that that's not the fault, that's not what it is, but it's a product of the very real fears around needing to, or feeling that there's a need to maintain that support as well. If that makes sense. Some very practical blocks. If we have a look at the next header, we have the fear of relationships. And I think that this is a big one. We've actually seen it come up a couple of times, haven't we?
We have, yes.
I think there was a comment that alluded to trust.
Yeah.
Comment that alluded to socializing. I certainly used to have a big fear around intimate relationships. And I think that something that's going to be quite scary and quite hard is that in us starting to get well, we might have this internal realization that we're going to have to learn to understand and navigate effectively healthy relationships. And it's also really common for us to have some fears around that. If we're going to become well, we might actually recognize and identify that we might need to cut certain people out of our lives. And we might need to cut out bad friends, bad influences. We might need to cut out specific family members or loved ones in order for us to start to get better as well. We also need to start to get assertive.
Yes.
We need to start to assert our boundaries to create positive change. There's a fear around us starting to be assertive in relationships is that it might potentially cause conflict.
Yeah.
And if we've spent a lifetime not being assertive, not telling people that we need them at arm's length, but inviting them in to take advantage of us, there's a huge amount of fear around learning to protect ourselves as well. I think this is an especially big fear as well when it comes to social anxieties, because in the past, if we've had our trust betrayed, if we've been bullied or cast aside by people as well, these events can start to teach us some particularly unhelpful lessons. And we did touch on this earlier. The issue is that fundamentally, we are social creatures. And as much as we might sometimes convince ourselves otherwise, we do need to all have at least one good trusting relationship. And in becoming well, we're going to have to either create for that for ourselves or maintain that as well. I think that a fear I encountered was the fear of learning to trust again, especially off the back of having been hurt a few times as well. And it is something that we'll have to do in our own time.
I think many people struggle with trust issues, don't they?
Yeah, I don't think that's uncommon.
I don't think it's an uncommon thing at all. So we hear that quite regularly, how important trusting ourselves and trusting other people is. I've got a few scenarios that I'm not going to go into, but trust was a key element for me as well, without doubt.
Absolutely. So I can see we've had a couple of comments that have come in. Self-care was high on my list, having lived for over 10 years hiding behind my illness and blaming my illness. I did not take any responsibility for myself. I relied on family and friends. So we've got someone that recognizes that as well.
Yeah.
The person making the comment has done some tremendous work on themselves over the last while as well. So it's good to have that hindsight and see the way that things have been. But spot on, having overcome a lot of that as well. I have had to cut out parts of my relationship to be able to have a better relationship with other. I've had to cut out. I've had
to cut out parts of my relationship to be able to have a better relationship with other more valuable people.
Absolutely. So having to cut out parts of the relationship, the ones that aren't self-serving, the ones that might be contributing to the mental illness, in order to work towards better relationships as well. I think it's a tough one because in life we have a few options when it comes to unhealthy relationships. You can either look to change the nature of the relationship to get it to a place where it's really helping us, but we can also look to, well, we might sometimes have to cut the relationships off in their entirety.
Absolutely.
And that can be scary, especially if we're in kind of codependent relationships. I'm not going to go into too much detail around this, but sometimes we can start to feel like we depend on other people for our love, our happiness, and everything that makes us feel okay. And if that relationship is unhealthy, it might not be actually serving us, but it can be really hard to let go of those kind of things.
Yeah,
that's it. Recognizing that happiness actually needs to be generated from within. That's a scary thing, especially if we've been depending on other people for it for a long time. There we go. So I can see that we're starting to come up to time. And what I would like to do is to skip to the last question that we've got. And the last question reads, what steps might you need to take in order to improve your mental well-being? So we've got a few ideas here at Seropi, but actually I kind of want to throw this back on perhaps the people that are watching right now as well.
Yeah.
To start to see what it is that they think they might need to keep doing or do going forward to improve their mental well-being. We've got a few ideas. We've always got a few ideas. And I think I just want to drag it back to that word balance that we were hearing about initially, right at the start. I don't think that wellness is about changing things dramatically. I think it's about small steps. And I think it's about starting to put a little bit of focus on a few key points in our lives and looking to start to make changes around that. I think, shall I just answer this personally and then
you answer it personally?
I'll answer it personally, then hand over to you. But for me, the changes that I needed to make: return to socializing, increasing my friendship groups. I felt like I started to belong to a community again. For me, I had to recognize the bad habits that I was falling into as well. I was using drugs and alcohol for a really long time to mask how I was truly feeling, and I had to learn to let go of that one in particular. For me, I had to reconnect with something that gave me value, because my life to that point, I hadn't been doing much that really meant anything to me. I spent a lot of time working in kitchens, which I quite liked, but it didn't make my heart sing. I spent some time working at a go-kart track, which was, again, a bit of fun, but it didn't really suit me, and I had to reconnect with a few elements around that. And a lot of it came from there. For yourself, Neil?
Well, one of the key things for me is very much the same as yours, is I had to reconnect with people, because that was kind of key for me. But because of the work that I did, I became very selective about how I connected back with people. So I recognized that people that didn't serve me well, then I had to kind of use something that I call closure. I would phone some people up and I would just say, I'm feeling better now, and get a response. And if they kind of said, well, you know, I don't really want to be with you anymore, I don't want to talk to you anymore, I would then just say, okay, that's absolutely fine, and I will move on. That's kind of closed it down, so I don't have to revisit things. And then I became a lot better, because I did it very gently, gradually. I started to build up the social connection that I needed. And I'm not saying for 1 minute it's going to stop at the social connection I've got at the moment. Is when I'm ready, I can decide whether I want to extend that or whether I want to keep it. And that leads back to balance, doesn't it?
Exactly.
I actually found that a real benefit. And the other thing that really started my pathway, without a doubt, was actually being truthful about things like thoughts and feelings, and whether people, if they kind of upset you, let them know that this is having an effect on you. And when I learned about assertive behavior and how I can actually make sure that my needs are being met, then it became a lot easier, because people had a choice, and we all have a choice, do we not? If I feel that my needs are not being met, I need to have a proper conversation around that. And then a person makes a choice. They make the choice of whether I'm kind of value to them, or whether they would find me being in that connection a bit of a struggle. So that really was the thing that helped me out more than anything.
That's some wonderful insight. Thank you, Neil. Okay, guys, I'm aware that we've come up to time. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I will apologise again for the technical difficulties that we had.
But he managed it well.
Well, just about. But for those of you that managed to stick around with us, thank you for keeping us company this afternoon. Thank you as well for some of the wonderful comments that we've seen. If you feel that you've gained anything that you would from today, please don't hesitate to leave us a little bit of feedback. It's really nice to have that feedback around the lives. But also, if you're not a member with us, if this is your first experience of anything Isopropia and you've had your curiosity piqued and you'd like a little bit more hands-on support, then do not hesitate to do a bit of research and seek a referral to us through your mental health practitioner at your GP surgeries on the Isle of Wight. Again, it's been an absolute pleasure. Take care of yourselves all.
Likewise.
And we